Hello once again, class. Glad to have you all here for another lecture. Today, we're going over some more lore of another horrifying world that I am quite fond of learning more about. Today, we are going over some of the lore of the bitter, cold, frozen world that is FrostPunk. Now, FrostPunk has some pretty extensive lore. Of course, there are the two main video games, but recently there was also a Kickstarter for an art book, a tabletop role playing game, and an anthology with short stories that take place in the world of Frostpunk, as well as DLC for the said two games that expand on the lore even more. So, because of that, today I am only going to be focusing on the coming of the Great Freeze, and specifically more so along the last autumn DLC that we can get in the first game. Depending on how much you guys enjoy this, I will most likely be talking more about the lore of Frostpunk, as it is a world that I am fascinated by, and I just also simply enjoy the games and I enjoy talking about it. Or at least in this universe, they're only games. When you travel as extensively as me, you tend to see some things that overlap out there in the cosmos. But anyway, today we are going over the origins of Frostpunk, the origins of the Great Freeze, and the last autumn DLC. So, Frostpunk is a somewhat steampunky-esque game. There are steampunk elements, such as a bunch of steam-powered things, including steam-powered automata of all things. But, of course, the frost in it also comes with the fact that it takes place during a post-apocalyptic scenario in which the entire planet has undergone what is known in world as the Great Freeze, which made everything on the planet have a global minimum. If you're on the poles, it has the same minimum as somewhere along the equator, for example. But how did this all come to be? Well, we actually don't exactly know. We don't know if it's something scientific. We don't know if it's something supernatural. We don't know if perhaps since this is a steampunk world that relies even more on coal than we did, maybe it somehow super sped up global warming. But, that wouldn't make sense for a full global minimum. There's even a theory in game that some scientists believe that perhaps the sun is dimming. But again, while that would cause overall temperatures to go down, it wouldn't cause a global minimum. So, while there are theories both in universe and in the community, we don't fully know how it started. However, what we do know is that the world starts in 1886. The climate is shifting. The British Empire is on the verge of collapse. The world is getting colder, and no one seems to be able to know why. Project to build generators is put into motion by the British government. The last autumn DLC specifically focuses around Site 113, also known as New Liverpool. Now, we don't know exactly where this is. We don't know if it's somewhere in England. We kind of know that it's in an island, so we don't know that if it's off the coast of England or Scotland or Ireland or Wales, etc., or if it's just in some random island in the middle of the Atlantic. We just simply know that it's north, as that's the only details we are given. Now, you may be wondering, why go north if the temperature is freezing? Why not go somewhere warmer, etc.? As I said before, the world itself is going to a global minimum, meaning no matter where you go, whether it's north, south, east, west, towards the poles or towards the equator, everywhere is approaching the same temperature, meaning north might actually be the best and safest way to go, as that's where things that are more equipped to handle the cold are located, since they already have to deal with cold anyway. But I digress. Site 113 is employed by the Imperial Exploration Company, otherwise known as the IEC for short, and were tasked with building a steam core generator. These steam core generators are massive technical marvels of creation that heat a decently large area with heat generated from coal in its massive steam engine to warm the area and hopefully make a place at least somewhat livable for people. Now, the fact that this big freeze was happening was, for the most part, kept under wraps to the public. Of course, information leaks, word gets out, but even when the word did start getting out, in those early days, during what is later known as the last autumn, not everyone believed it. They either thought that the world was just simply cooling a little bit, or just thought it was a particularly bad winter coming, etc., etc. And so, even when information started to get out, not everyone believed it right away, unfortunately. But even with that, the situation in England was bad, to say the least. In fact, the workers working on this generator at Site 113 were there to simply escape England for the most part. It was promised to be a steady job with steady pay, and it helped them escape the riots that were happening in England, and it helped them escape the bread queues, as, because of lowering temperatures, food was becoming more and more scarce as time went on, as crops and livestock started to fail. And so, to simply have a steady income away from the chaos was all they really needed in order to sign up for this job. They weren't told much, they weren't told why, or how big of a necessity this was, just simply that they were doing this out of a precaution, a sort of just in case, Oh, don't worry, it's not too bad, we're just doing this just in case of the worst case scenario. No big deal. But of course, it was a much bigger deal than any of them could have imagined. We learn later, in the Last Autumn DLC, that a sudden frost destroyed a plantation in India, and that they are in revolt against the British government. Now, remember, this takes place during 1886, so the British Empire is still very much still a thing, India is still under British rule, and so on. So we see this as the world itself is being affected by this. It's not just England, it's not just Europe, it's not just the Northern Hemisphere, but it's even spread to India. And we can see that with the revolts and the sudden collapse, that the theory of going north is probably the best route, as obviously a nation like India isn't quite as equipped to handle extreme colds like countries that are located further north are. And so that's why we can see how it could get so bad so fast. However, we can also see that it's not just the English that are preparing for the worst. You can find an old tavern where the owner said that the French used to frequent there. They would drink, they would laugh, they would eat, and they would plan out their plans for the future and what they could do to escape the coming cold. But they stopped coming. And the tavern owner says that you can take whatever you want because he is leaving too. So we can see that other nations are also preparing for the worst, and that it's not just England who knows that this is coming. And this also shows that not just England is this far off in their preparations, and that other nations in the world are also getting things ready to fight the coming cold. In fact, you can find massive railroad tracks that are incredibly large, both in length and in width. And they have these massive support beams as if they're trying to keep up something incredibly heavy. We can find that these are for frost breakers, as the French call them. Massive trains as large as ships, which is why the tracks are so large and need such big braces, as the trains are, quite frankly, massive. We can see that this is probably one of the ways that the French are trying to combat this, making these massive trains almost as if they're arcs for humanity to travel along with. In fact, we can even find that the tracks at one point go under the ice and seem to disappear into them. This has led to a theory that these frost breakers that the French are constructing are not just meant to be trains that are going over the land, but also underground, perhaps in an attempt to escape the cold, and obviously to perhaps not expose the technology or the circuitry or the engines to cold constantly, because while it is heated by coal and steam, presumably, whether that cold would most likely take a toll on any machine, especially if it has to constantly run in order to keep people from freezing to death. But we learn that Site 113 is not the only site that British are working on. There is another site, Site 107, that we can learn was destroyed because the steam core for their engine exploded and killed many in the process. There's also Site 120, but we find that that was also destroyed by fires and riots, as we learn from survivors of Site 120 that the leaders treated the workers there like slaves, hence eventually triggering a revolt that caused fires and also an explosion that also killed many. And while we can't find it directly, we can find resources that were bound for a Site 157, otherwise known as Winterhome. They were lost crates with resources inside of them for the convoy that was going to Route 57 had not made it there for one reason or another. You can take the supplies, or you can just leave them there in the hopes that someone will eventually come along and bring them to their appropriate site. But we learn that another tragic fate befell Site 157. In fact, it is such an extensive event that is relatively important to the lore that I'm actually going to give it its own video eventually, so stay tuned for that lecture. But apart from these sites, by the time winter properly rolls around and this last grace period of the last autumn is gone, England and the UK at large is in complete shambles. Obviously, by this time, with India having crop failures and rebellions across the former British Empire rising up, as well as revolts in the UK proper, obviously more and more people are now in firm belief that something horrible is coming. It is not just a simple playoff. It is not a thing that can be kept under wraps anymore. It is not just simply, oh, this is just going to be a bad winter is all, and we'll eventually bounce back. It is very clear that the world is irreversibly changing. In fact, not only this, but word gets out that not all the generators are going to be ready in time, which leads to mass panic across the UK, as obviously all the generators aren't going to be ready in time. There's not going to be enough space for everyone because of this. People are going to die. And so in a way to sort of at least try and quell the riots, the UK government sets up a lottery system random chance on who gets to go to the generators that are for sure going to be set up in time, whether rich or poor, young or old, etc., etc. However, people claim that it is rigged, and therefore lose all faith in it. And this actually triggers a mass exodus to the British colonies, such as Australia, New Zealand, India, Canada, etc., etc. But as we learned earlier, the world itself is approaching a global minimum. So, with the exception of possibly Canada, these places are arguably even worse off than England proper is. As we learned in India, there was a mass freeze that led to crop shortages. And since New Zealand and Australia and such are much more hot climates, they were also obviously not equipped to handle the cold. So these warmer climates that people are escaping to are actually even far worse off, and they don't know that when they're running away. You can imagine that this probably led to even more deaths, even more hunger shortages, and even more tragedy in this already tragic, hopeless world. Eventually, you can intercept a letter that was meant for one of the workers at Site 113 of a mother telling him that his brother was killed during a demonstration against forced conscription for the second year of the Balkan War. Now, this is kind of interesting, as the Balkan War was a real war that happened in our world, or at least the world that I'm broadcasting to, but it happened in 1912, not 1886 like it's seemingly happening in the game. This is interesting, as we're left to wonder, why did this war break out? Many probably rightly assume that in this world it was for resources. A resource war, simply fighting over whatever's left so they can funnel it to the engines to make hopefully as many steam engines as they can to heat as many places as they can. And quite grimly, even despite anything, people are still fighting with each other. Even at the end of the world, we're fighting over who has the right resources for things. And you can imagine, possibly grimly, that the British Empire is also doing this to perhaps even lower their own population. Of course, if more people die in wars, then that's less mouths to feed in the coming frost. It's less people that they have to worry about having to send to these generators for warmth. Now, we obviously don't know if that is the case, but given everything else happening in this world, it definitely isn't that much of a stretch. Rather grimly, towards the end of the DLC, we can find that Ebenezer Craven, which is the current Prime Minister of England during this time, decides to redirect resources from the generators. Now, this is a horrible decision, and we don't quite know why they're doing this. Perhaps it's to funnel into the Balkan War, perhaps it's to funnel resources away from the generators, and in the best case scenario for this idea, I can imagine possibly funneling them towards the people, and rather than the generators that will eventually heat people in order to survive. Maybe the Prime Minister is also having a delusion that it's not going to be as bad as some people think or say, or that it'll eventually work itself out, and that's why he's doing it. But we learn that this would doom many in the future, as because of this, along with the other sites that we learn failed for one reason or another, without these resources, some generators weren't finished. Some that were finished in rushed jobs that led to failures. Some didn't work at all. Some eventually did work, but as I said, eventually failed. But regardless of this, the site you play as, Site 113, New Liverpool, does finish its generator. signaling that, at the very least, people can find sanctuary there, and hopefully, find some kind of life in the coming winter. Now, that was the lore of the early days of the Great Freeze and of the last autumn that this world ever saw. It is a grim world that I find myself getting more and more lost in. And I do highly recommend the games. And I also highly recommend checking out the anthology's art book and tabletop role-playing game when they are released, as I am very, very excited for those. But be sure to let me know what you think of this world, and if you've played the games, let me know what you think of them. I personally really like them. But, as always, stay warm, and until next time.